Yeah, so I just like to offer this as a set of skills that I've really found kind of across the board helpful when it comes to encountering folks from a non-therapist perspective, right? Whether this is my friend or my family member or someone who's a client who's out in the field with me, or a coworker or someone I'm supervising, whatever. If I'm especially in a non-therapist perspective, there is even a better chance, I think, sometimes that this model is helpful, because sometimes people don't want our help, and sometimes people partly want our help and partly aren't ready for it, or have a different idea, or think they're, start doing something and then kind of backtrack. And so it can be really helpful to have a lens on what I call stages of change model. So a couple more people just popped in. That's great. In the chat for you, I am dropping our handout for tonight. Our handout for tonight it's actually a 2-page handout. You folks are getting so much information from me right now. And the 2-page handout, as you can see, I'll just share my screen so that we can all see together, but hopefully you can access it on your own device as well, because you can follow along. And this is a interactive webinar as well, so we'll be doing a little bit of breakout room discussions, not maybe quite as much as last time, but a little bit. So here's the first page of the handout, just kind of some key points. This is something I've kind of been changing at the last moment this afternoon, so this is hopefully an improved version of what we've had before, but it's still a work in progress. So as always, I would love your feedback and thoughts on this webinar and on the handouts and all of that kind of stuff. So we'll be going through these stages of change, and then this one you kind of have to turn your head sideways for. This part of the graph is illustrating different approaches that can be helpful for folks at different stages of change, if that makes sense. The next page is this upper part is a revisitation of this part. Okay, so this is just another way of saying it, right? When people are less interested in change versus when they're more interested in change, this text-based version might land better for you, or this more turn your head sideways graphic might land better for you. And then last but not least, here are some scenarios. Okay, so welcome back. If you haven't been to a webinar before, my name's Daye Hagel. I'm the director and the founder of Mental Health Wilderness First Aid, and what we do is run mental health first aid training programs for folks who live, work, or play out in wilderness and remote areas. So we have a 16-hour certification course and a 40-hour course, and we offer staff trainings of different lengths. And this is our winter webinar series for filling in a little bit of the off-season. If you're in the Northern Hemisphere, a lot of us are in our off-season right now. I have a background as a wilderness guide and as a clinical counselor as well. So here's a brief overview of what we can get to today. We're going to talk a little bit about ambivalence. I'm going to go through this model called stages of change, just as a curiosity. Who has encountered the idea of stages of change before this workshop? You encountered it anywhere else? Oh, very interesting. Okay, fantastic. Like I said, it is something that we now cover in the 16 and the 40-hour versions of the course, because I find it so helpful when we're helping people who may or may not be interested in our help, right? We'll have some scenarios discussion, and we'll talk about options for responding when people do want our help and when people don't want our help, and when they're somewhere in between. This will tie in a little bit with, for those of you who were here last week, and we were talking about boundaries, and it will tie into our boundaries discussion as well. As a heads up, again, this is an experiential workshop. Everything I talk about in this workshop is invitational. Everything is optional. You do not owe me an explanation. If you would rather observe or you'd rather sit out of a breakout room, that's completely fine. You will get the most out of it if you go into the breakout rooms. And if you'd rather not, I'm still glad that you're here, and you're welcome to be here as long as you're okay with there being a little bit of kind of dead space when other people are in breakout rooms. We will talk very briefly, as you saw in the confirmation of the webinar, we will talk very briefly about self-harm, disordered eating, leaving abusive relationships, that kind of thing, because those kinds of situations are certainly relevant with stages of change. There is a North American chat support line, 988, if that's ever helpful, or you're welcome to chat with me as well. Okay, does this person want my help? Not everybody wants our help, and sometimes people seem to want our help, and yet their actions don't line up with their words, or perhaps they don't line up with their words as much as we were expecting, or even that they were expecting. And sometimes when we're supporting somebody who's in a variable stage of change, we can feel like we're in this like tug of war with them, either consciously or subconsciously. That can be a frustrating experience for us as supporters or helpers, as well as it can be a frustrating experience for the person who might be partly wanting help and partly reaching out to you for help, perhaps, but also is feeling maybe a bit overwhelmed at the kind of help that we want to offer, or maybe finds that they're not as able to engage these change techniques as we might have hoped. So I want to lean into the idea of ambivalence here, because I like to say in the class, I always say two things can be true at the same time, right? Sometimes part of us wants something and another part doesn't, and that might be conscious or it might be subconscious as well. Let's read a couple of scenarios to get us started. So we have Peyton as a first heads up. Can somebody volunteer to read Peyton, just because I talk a lot?
I can read it.
Thanks, Rachel.
Peyton. You notice that Peyton often complains about having a stomachache after meals. She also seems to spend long periods of time in the outhouse or excuses herself to off in the woods alone immediately after mealtimes. One day she admits to you that she feels guilty about overeating and has been making herself throw up. She says, I thought coming out here in the field might help me stop, but it's been rough.
Thank you, Rachel. Thanks for talking through my typo there as well. Okay, so somebody who is looks like trying to make a change, hoping to make a change, struggling with how that's been. Right? Does this person want help? What kind of help might be helpful? Can someone else read Quint?
I can read it.
Go ahead, Lisa.
As you are talking one night around a fire, Quint tells you he is struggling with motivation, finding purpose in life, and has difficulty getting out of bed many mornings. I always just thought stuff like depression was all in your head, but my sister thinks I should go talk to a shrink or something. What do you think? Therapy is so expensive, and I don't believe in pharmaceuticals. But I don't know. It's just starting to feel like I've got to do something. What I'm doing isn't working.
Thanks, Lisa. Appreciate it. Okay. All right. Sometimes people are in this ambivalent or nebulous land with where they're going, but they're starting to recognize, okay, something's got to change here, or I'd like things to be different. How do you engage with discussion? Is it a good time to jump right into problem solving? Is it time to sit back and do more active listening? When are boundaries necessary, etc.? So like I said, this is our outline of our course. Now, in the course, we use the same outline. This is part of our field notes page. It's also the outline to the course, and it's also the outline to how we suggest that you approach someone who's having a hard time, right? A scenario where you're going to support somebody. We use the same outline and structure in the 16-hour course as we do in the 40-hour course, and we just build on it. And one thing that you might be familiar with, for those of you who have taken the courses, is part of the secondary survey, right? Now, after this, the primary survey, which is all about, okay, let's just get safe and stable. Let's regulate everyone's nervous systems. Let's make sure we're in safe places, etc. Okay. And then we get into something called the secondary survey, which is more figuring out where do we go from here? What do we do next, right? And so we talk about, well, you might want to gather more information so that you can use that to figure out what to do next. You'll figure out, now that the person's regulated, is this a good time for problem solving or advice or planning or thought challenging or behavior challenging, any of the more rational, logical things. Right? And we always encourage folks to consider, as part of that overall assessment, secondary assessment, what stage of change is the person in? In other words, does this person want your help? So this is actually part of your paperwork, and it's just this little reminder to avoid getting frustrated if people maybe don't want our help, and also to attune our response to when people do want our help. So here is a brief overview to stages of change model for supporting someone who's having a hard time. Now, this was originally a model that was developed in the 1970s as part of a smoking cessation project, right? So there was a project where they were bringing folks in who wanted to quit smoking, and they were on this program to, explore different avenues for helping support with that. And the researchers wanted a way to describe where people were at in their journey with wanting to change significant behavior. In this case, an addictive behavior, right? So they came up with this model called stages of change. Depending on what version of the model you look at, it has 5 stages or 6 stages. And it's still very commonly today used in addictions and substance use or substance abuse counseling, right? And at the same time, this is now a model that could be used to look at any behavior that might benefit from change. So it's also something you see come up a lot in something like in employment counseling, right? How motivated is this person to switch careers or to go back and do some retraining or to apply to this, whatever, right? It can also be used to look at, is this person ready to leave a relationship, right? Or to, we sometimes look at runaways through a stages of change model. Is this person interested and ready to return home? Other problematic behaviors, self-harming behavior or disordered eating behavior, or on a more simplified level, right? Is this person interested in your idea for a mindfulness program that might be helpful for their anxiety? Is this person interested in seeing the therapist that you recommend? Does this person want to put a number in their phone right now, right? So you can use it on quite a kind of simple level, or you can use it on a more complex level if you're actually engaging in therapy with somebody. So there's 5 stages of change, according to the model that I'm going to use. Okay, I have a little bit of a condensed model. The first stage is contemplative. Now, before I go into this, I'm going to point out that stages of change is a model, and it's a very helpful model, I find. It's also a model that is in the theoretical realm, and people are not theories, right? People are organic, and so in real life, people jump through the stages. They don't necessarily go in order, although there is a pattern to it. They don't necessarily go in order, and things can be a little messy and overlapping, right? So I acknowledge that. But this is a pretty good way of looking at when folks are having a hard time. Someone who's pre-contemplative is perhaps dealing with maybe some large behaviors that you might think could really benefit from change, but for whatever reason, they're not considering change. They're either not considering, or they're not interested in it, or they're not ready for it at all, right? So this might be for a couple of reasons. It might be that the person's in denial about the behavior actually being a problem. It could also be that the person just genuinely has a different value set than you and just disagrees with you about whether the behavior is actually a problem, if that makes sense, right? And the example I like to use here is, think about how much our cultural conceptions of marijuana use have changed over the last 30 years, right? So behavior that today most people would consider in the realm of normalcy, depending on where you are in the world, right? Maybe 30 years ago, most people in that same part of the world might have considered quite problematic, right? So it could just be a difference in value set. It could be that the person's actually in denial. Someone who is contemplative is considering change or starting to be open to change. They might be starting to think or to say that, yes, I can see how this is a problem, or this is causing X and Y in my life. I wish I could. They might be open to talking about it. They're not actually taking any steps in the direction of change at this time. And that's a key differential between this and the next stage. So contemplative and preparation are often kind of overlapping. It might be hard to figure out which one a person's really in. But the key difference between them is that a preparation stage person hasn't actively made the change for any period of time, but they are open to talking about it, and they've taken one or more steps in the direction of change, right? And so the way that I have seen this come up in a clinical setting is, maybe I've been working with someone for a period of time who's struggling with substance use, for instance, and maybe we've been meeting for several weeks. And at one point, the person comes into my office and says, "Okay, Daye, I looked up that treatment center that you were talking about last night, and I went on their website and I filled out their application for their 6-month, on-site training or on-site rehab program, and I have a meeting with the intake coordinator on Wednesday." That's a preparation stage person, right? Now, in real life, what I've seen happen as well is that, okay, Wednesday comes, the person's interested and engaged and has taken the next step of going through the intake process, right? And then by the time a spot actually opens up for them, they get through the wait list and they're in the program, 6 months have gone by and they've gone all the way through all the steps 3 times in that time, right? So real life certainly can be messy. This is a pretty good way of looking at it. Action phase is the person has actively made the behavior change and has maintained it for a certain period of time, right? So maybe they've been in the treatment center for 3 months, maybe they've been home for 6 months, maybe they've maintained a sober lifestyle for 10 years, right? And they might always consider themselves in a maintenance stage, right, of that behavior change. And then last but not least, depending on what model you look, people treat relapses differently, but it's often seen as part of the overall stages, right? It's an expected part of the model that there will be lapses or relapses, and that's where somebody has maintained a change for a certain period of time and now they've slipped into an old pattern of behavior, right? I fell off the wagon, or there's some replication of past behavior. Now, if the person's in a relapse stage, you identify that there's a relapse happening, you get a bonus question. And the bonus question is, what stage did they land back in? Because sometimes when people have a relapse, they go all the way back to pre-contemplative and they're like, you know, Daye, this was never really a big deal. I actually prefer to live my life this way. I would like you to stop calling me, right? Okay, they're back to pre-contemplative. Sometimes when people have a relapse, they're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that happened. Gosh, I gotta like reevaluate my trigger protocol or my trigger awareness. I gotta call my accountability person. I'm gonna sign up for whatever, right? And maybe they're back to an action phase. So you get a little bonus question if you see a relapse. So that's a brief overview to the actual model. Let's return. I'm gonna add 3 more scenarios, so a total of 5 scenarios tonight. And then I'm gonna put you into breakout rooms. And because you won't have time to talk about all the scenarios in detail, what this is going to allow you to do, though, is if we just read through them, you are going to be able to pick out who's the most interesting scenarios to talk about. And that's my hope for the value of this section. So 3 more scenarios. Could somebody please read Akash for me?
I can read it, Daye, if you can hear me.
Yeah, Julia, go ahead.
Okay. Akash frequently uses cannabis between tasks. When a teammate comments that maybe he shouldn't smoke on work time, he says, "It's natural. I just have a little to take the edge off." However, you have noticed him becoming increasingly open about his use, and it consuming more of his time and attention. Yesterday, you noticed that some sensitive gear Akash was tasked to sort was left out in disarray in the rain while he was on an extended smoke break. When he came back, he said, "Oh, don't worry about that stuff. I'll take care of it. I actually work better when I'm a little baked."
Thanks, Julia. Appreciate it. Okay, 2 more. Eric?
I can do it.
Melita, and welcome back, Melita. Go ahead.
Great. Eric comes to you for first aid for a small series of circular burns on his arm. As you are bandaging them, he says, "I used to burn myself with my dad's cigarettes to deal with stress. I don't anymore. I was just really overwhelmed last night and didn't know what else to do. It kind of helps me."
Thanks, Melita. Okay, so we have a whole section I'll point this out, in 40 Hour, we have a whole series of modules on things like disordered eating, which we might have been talking about with Peyton's behavior. We have a whole teaching module on self-harming behavior, like non-suicidal self-injury, which is what we might be seeing Eric as practicing. And so we have lots more content and teaching around those ones. So a little bit of a focused topic tonight and just trying to figure out where people at in their stages of change module, and that'll help us. But just know that we have more content around these folks and these topics too. Okay, last one is a little long, a lot going on, but can someone read Denise for me?
I can read.
Go ahead, Corey, thanks.
Okay, Denise. Denise has talked openly before about having anxiety, depression, and CPTSD. You also learned that she has recently initiated divorce proceedings after a 12-year marriage, during which she left 14 times. The longest I was away was 3 months while he was in treatment, she says. I was really hopeful that he had changed, but it didn't last. You notice that Denise wears a lot of bright colors and wears an angel necklace. She is deeply religious at this point in her life and moved provinces to live in a duplex with her sister. I like that the kids can be with their cousins, she says. I hated taking them away from their dad. She brought extra gear into the field, sleeping underneath 3 sleeping bags and an entire Pelican case full of backup batteries so she could leave her headlamp on constantly as a nightlight. Denise went on 4 practice camping trips with her cousin to get ready for this placement, as she has never camped before this year.
Okay, thanks, Corey. So yes, lots going
Sure.
on. Okay, so I just want to pop you into short breakout rooms, and you won't have time to talk about each of these folks in detail. What I'd like to invite you to do is start with the most interesting person and just discuss what stage of change do you think this person's at. Okay? Don't get too far into what you might do about it or what you might offer to this person, because we're going to talk about that next. At this point in time, I just want you practice getting used to the language around which stage is which, and having a little bit of familiarity with these scenarios so that we can chew on them next. Okay? So let's have 1 or 2 comments. Anyone, who was the most interesting person that you talked about, and what stage of change do you think they might be in? Rachel?
The first person we spoke about was the fellow with the circular burns on his arm.
Eric?
Eric. Yeah, and we were talking about both maybe relapse and pre-contemplative. I can't say the word. Sort of like kind of in denial and relapsing, because like I don't do that anymore.
Interesting. Yeah. And I haven't given you much information or background on any of the scenarios really, except Denise, who you maybe have too much background on. But that is partly intentional. Actually, I'll say I haven't given you too much background on any of these folks because I want you to be able to project onto it. Like we use these scenarios in the courses, and I want folks to be able to project onto the scenarios whatever is most relevant to them, like the age of the person or what the context of the trip is or whatever, right? And the person may have different backgrounds and different interests in change. Like you don't have a ton of information at this point, right? And so part of it as well is to allow you to do a thought exercise as you go through our course and as you make a field support plan for this person or whatever it is. And that could go in a number of different directions. The point is to allow you to chew on some things. So yeah, certainly a relapse. Certainly there might be some denial popping up in his statements for sure. 1 more comment on 1 more person. Who was the most interesting person that you talked about? John?
I thought Peyton was interesting, partly because this is something that is pretty common for me dealing with. But it was interesting because I read at the end more closely. I thought coming out here on the trip might help me stop. And then I was like, stop what? Is it stopping the throwing up after eating, or is it stopping the overeating? So I was like, I wasn't even sure which thing they were trying to stop.
Sure.
I
Great.
read it again.
Okay, I love that, and that's going to dovetail into how about Denise? Like, let's just look at Denise for a moment because there's a lot going on with Denise, and we actually talk about Denise in the 16 and the 40-hour course through different lenses, right? One of the lenses we look at Denise through is the stages of change lens. One is through a trauma-informed lens, and one is through a resilience lens, and so we actually return to Denise a lot. What behavior are we even talking about with change with Denise? Melita, I'm getting some nods from you. Yeah. So one thing that we talk about with Denise is like people can be in different stages of change for different behaviors at the same time, right? With the leaving the relationship portion of Denise's scenario, I don't know about you folks. I'm picking up on, it sounds like she's been in a lot of the different stages over time. Like there's been a cycle there going for her. But it sounds like right now, to me, I'm seeing action stage. Like there's been some real like changes that she's made in her life. There's been like logistical changes she's done, all that kind of stuff. I'm seeing action. I might support Denise in, you know, in an action stage, which we'll talk about in a sec. For the behavior of, I feel anxious, or I maybe have a trauma trigger or something like that, and therefore I need to bring 3 sleeping bags and a whole Pelican case full of backup batteries. What stage is she in with that behavior? Well, that might be pre-contemplative, right? And now I'm like, okay, well, maybe I want to meet her where she's at with the pre-contemplative stage. Do I need to do anything about that behavior? It might depend on where you're at. Okay, so let's take a look. Let's take a little bit closer look at what we can do with the information about stages of change. Sorry, I have 2 different PowerPoints open that look very similar. Which one is this? I got the right one. Okay, good. Okay, so let's take a look at what we could do next. Okay, can you folks all see? I just updated my OS, so that's giving me suspicion here about what can you all see the PowerPoint? Yes? Okay, good. Okay, so our approach to supporting someone who is in a relationship with wanting to change behavior, this depends on what stage the person's in. And so I've made this kind of fancy looking chart. If you look sideways, you can see that my responses to supporting someone might overlap. So this is on the first page of that handout you have. If this is useful to you, great. If it seems overly complex, let's just look at it like this. So this is going to be the same graph rotated. And all this is okay, there's a bit of a continuum here between people who are less interested in change and people who are more interested in change. Okay? And I've kind of summarized the stages along the top here. Now, relapse is kind of a funny category, but let's say, you know, less interested in change starts at pre-contemplative, and then moving up towards action, you're interested in change, okay? Good rules for all the stages are you're going to remind yourself of what stage of change the person's in. And this can be helpful, not even necessarily to say it out loud or write it in your paperwork or anything like that, but just if you have in the back of your mind, oh, this person's in a contemplative stage, right? If I'm talking to Quint, maybe I'm talking to Quint for quite a long time. Maybe Quint's my friend in my like ongoing life. And Quint's constantly like struggling with anxiety and motivation and getting out of bed in the morning and holding down jobs. And Quint's like constantly like, kind of coming to me and saying, hey, do you think I should do anything? I looked up this thing, I don't know. And like if I get frustrated with that, it can help me just to remind myself of, oh, Quint's contemplative, right? He's interested in talking about this. He's maybe interested in looking up things that I send him, but he's not actually making the change yet. And that can just help me and my own frustration and patience levels, right? To have that model. So that's one of the ways I use stage of change model. It's helpful for all the stages to honor the person's autonomy and agency, right? And I might do this in my own head. I might not say it out loud, but I also might say it out loud to the person, right? Hey, you're an adult, if it's an adult, right? You're an adult, you have the right to make decisions here. And reminding myself that, hey, this person has the right to make decisions that I don't agree with. This person has the right to go back and forth with behavior. This person has the right to be contemplative, right? And so that can help myself again, and it can also help the person to hear that out loud, especially if the person is more pre-contemplative, right? And they're not ready for the behavior change, and they feel like everyone's on their case. And then to hear out loud from someone, hey, you're an adult, you have the right to make decisions here. Now that doesn't mean that the behavior is not going to have a consequence or an outcome, right? Or a reality in the field of what you can and can't support. But we'll get to that in a moment. You can get really curious, right? Especially if the person is in one of the earlier stages of change. So your active listening tools are good here. In the 40-hour course, we talk a little bit more about another subset of tools called motivational interviewing. And motivational interviewing is, well, it's a whole field that you can get very trained in. But we talk about some brief tools for helping support folks who are in earlier stages of change through a motivational interviewing lens. So one of them is scaling questions, and scaling questions are just 0 to 10 questions. And so I'll give an example, right? A scaling question might be, hey Quint, you know, we've been talking for a while, and I'm just curious, I want to get a sense of where you're at. Like 0 to 10, how interested are you in going to this mindfulness group that I keep trying to get you to go to, right? Mindfulness in the woods, perhaps. That's Strathcona Park Lodge. How interested are you in that? And Quint says, I don't know, like 3. Okay, so the scaling question has 2 different ways it can be helpful. One, it can give you a snapshot of where the person's at, and then you can also ask over time and see if it's changing. So just in and of itself, a scaling question is helpful. Okay, 3 out of 10. The other way a scaling question can be helpful is if you follow it up. So the magic of the scaling question from a motivational interviewing perspective is in the follow-up. Okay, so 3 is really low, right? Quint's not that interested in your mindfulness art in the park. But it's not 0. So now you can get really curious about the 3. Like, okay, where does 3 come from and why isn't it 0, right? What's that little bit of you that said 3 rather than 0, Quint? Like, what's that about? And so you can get curious about that, and that allows the person to expand that narrative. The other thing you could do, or another example of a follow-up would be like, I don't know, so let's say the person says 6. Okay, so now 6 is still on the lower end, but there's a little more motivation there. Okay, now Quint, what could we do to make it from a 6 into an 8, right? So you can build with scaling questions. Another thing that we could do with our conversation topics are quadrants. This is something called conversation quadrants, where you can sketch this out if you have a piece of paper in front of you, because if you do that, it'll get in your muscle memory. So what you're going to do on your piece of paper is you're just going to draw a box, and you're going to draw lines through the box, okay? And then across the top of the box, you're going to write good, good, okay? And then on the bottoms, you're going to write bad, bad. And then now you're going to do the columns, okay? And the first column is going to be no change, and the second column is going to be change. Okay. Okay, so now what you have is you have 4 areas of conversation that you could weave the conversation through. And how this translates into actual questions or prompts or kind of conversation topics is you're going to have one question that's what is good about not changing? Like, what is good about staying as you are? For instance, with, I don't know, let's take Eric, right? Eric looks like has been burning himself, so there's some non-suicidal self-injury there. And the first thing you want to do is lean into, okay, let me just really get curious about where this behavior is coming from. What is good about not changing the behavior, right? How is that? So you said it kind of helps you. Like, tell me a little bit more about that, right? So you get really curious about that. The second question you're gonna, or pardon me, I'll get to the order of the questions next. The other question that's over in this quadrant would be, okay, what would be good about changing? What is bad about not changing? What would be bad about changing? And then the order that you ask the questions matters, or the order that you kind of prompt the conversation to go matters. So you always start where the person's at. What is good about staying as you are? Then you move to what would be bad about changing? What would be bad about stopping the behavior? Which is a very similar question to the first question, but it's not the same question, right? And so that just really allows you to explore all of this for this person. Then you move the conversation towards the idea of, okay, what is bad about staying as you are? What is bad about this behavior? And then finally, what could be good about changing? Right? So in the longer course, we actually practice this, and for the sake of time, part of me was like, oh, we'll have time to practice this. We won't have time to practice this. But in the longer course, we actually give folks a chance to practice this, but this can be a nice way of weaving through a conversation with someone who's been having a hard time, starting where they're at and unpacking the reasons for the behavior, and then moving towards that, like that 3 out of 10 part of them that does want to change. Okay, a couple more ideas. When people are less interested in change, you can reflect your own concerns and, your own perspective. Okay, so, what I see is this, or what I'm concerned about is this. You're going to maintain boundaries around what you can and can't support in the field. And for those of you who were here last week, we talked about different ways of offering boundaries. We talked about a gentle boundaries model. We talked about a DESO model. We talked about boundaries as choices, or framing boundaries as choices. That can be really good, especially when folks are in a pre-contemplative space, right? They're not ready for change. And you're like, hey, okay, I hear where this is coming from for you. You have a cool conversation around, what's serving them about the behavior, and then what's problematic about it, etc. And then you boil down to, hey, look, we want to help support you, and we like that you're here in the field with us, right? And if you decide that you're ready to change this behavior, then we can support you in this way, and we'd like to support you to stay in the field. If you decide that it's not the right time to change this behavior and it's serving you for whatever reason, at that point we'll say, look, we can't support you in the field, but we do want to support you to get home so that you can be in a safer place or a better place or have more supports around you or whatever. And you might get a sense of how, like, that's quite a firm boundary, what I just said, right? It's pretty clear what I can and can't support in the field. But sometimes framing the boundary as a choice goes back to honoring that person's agency and autonomy, right? You have the right to make decisions about what you do here, and here is what we can and can't support, right? You might also consider doing nothing. And this depends on the context, it depends on your role with the person, it depends what the behavior is, right? But you might consider doing nothing or waiting, perhaps disengaging, right? Sometimes people don't want our help, and sometimes the best thing to do is to not engage in the kind of potential power struggle, right? The picture that I offered at the beginning of this webinar was the picture of the two dogs kind of pulling back and forth on that toy, right? And sometimes engaging with someone who doesn't want our help feels like a bit of a power struggle. So sometimes the best thing to do is to drop the rope and be like, okay, maybe you'll want support in the future, and then I'll be here, right? So before we go further into ideas for when people do want our help or are farther along in wanting behavior change, I'm just going to throw you back into the same breakout rooms for simplicity, because you already kind of know each other, and ask you to reflect on Akash, Denise, Eric, Peyton, and Quint again, and ask you, when might you do nothing, right? So come up with at least one of these people for at least one behavior, and come up with a time when it might be best to not try to change this behavior if they're not ready for it, okay? And then again, try to reflect on at least one person, at least one behavior. When might you set a boundary around, okay, I get this person isn't interested in change, but at this point in time, here's the boundary I would set because of this reason. Does that make sense? When might you do nothing? When might you set a boundary? Just another 5-minute breakout room. Okay, welcome back. Another quick breakout room. My goal is to be leaving for supper with my kids at about 10 after, so you folks feel free to stay as long as you like up to there. Let's have a couple of comments. What did you chat about? Who might you set a boundary with, and or who might you decide to disengage and not get into a power struggle with?
Hey, Dave. We talked about, well, for me, I know we talked about Akash, and that one would definitely be a boundary, almost like a bit of a safety issue, because just where he's at and the lackadaisical way of like, oh, well, just whatever you might get, depending on the context, if you're like out backcountry or urban, either way, like it's a problem. And then we also talked about Eric as well, and potentially that might be a boundary. So if we were talking on an outdoor backcountry thing, that might be a more serious boundary than if it was a more urban type setting situation.
Mm-hmm.
So just the context of sort of where you're at.
Yes. Yeah, great. And again, another good reminder that, like, I haven't given you a lot of context about where you are at, and in the course we invite folks to consider where's the most likely places that you would be at in the work that you do, right? Because we have all kinds of folks come through the courses. And with a lot of people point out too that with Akash, people most commonly pick out that Akash is the one we're going to set boundaries around, and fair enough. And sometimes people point out, well, it might depend on what's my relationship with Akash, right? Is this my coworker? Is this someone I'm supervising? Sometimes people can imagine times when you might take a different tack, but certainly a lot of folks identify that when there's safety issues, that's times when we're more leaning into, okay, this is a boundary and here's how we're going to frame it. And depending on your context, it might be something that you identify, hey, the boundary's been violated and we have X policy or whatever, and just the decision is now that you're going to leave the field. And sometimes people think, okay, we can set a boundary about this going forward, and now you have a choice about continuing the behavior or not, and maybe we could keep you in the field if you agree to change the behavior. So it just depends, but we always talk about those kinds of things. Let's have one more comment about times where you might do nothing versus set a boundary. Corey.
So I would probably set a boundary with Peyton. My breakout room pal suggested having one of those box chat throughs, which I think is a great idea, to see where she's at in terms of being willing to change. But in the wilderness, I'd be worried about like just dehydration, because we get a lot of our salt through food, or like our electrolytes through food. And so if all the food is being thrown up and this person has no calories on board and also is getting dehydrated, that's just like a medical risk to me as well. And so I might set it up like if this person is like quite willing to change and they were willing to do something where it would take a lot more supervision, but like if they were willing to like stick around after every meal for an hour so their food would be digested or whatever, then maybe they could stay. But otherwise I'd probably be like, this isn't the right, I appreciate you're here, but like this isn't a treatment, like an eating disorder treatment facility per se, and we're concerned about safety.
Yeah, lovely. So thanks for naming that as well, like safety concerns. We talk in the 40-hour course in our disordered eating module, we talk specifically about exactly what you just named. And so I don't know if you have a background in potentially supporting folks who have disordered eating practices, but we talk about meal support ideas. And one of the meal support ideas for people might be planning around meals, not only because maybe there is a physiological risk if the person is purging in that way, but also just because if you're in a relationship with food that is challenging for whatever reason, meals can be a really triggering time or an emotionally vulnerable time. And so some of the meal support ideas might be, time limits around meals, or what are we going to do before and after the meal, or we're going to like buddy you with someone or whatever. But it might also just be like emotionally, hey, here's kind of a distracting non-food thing that we can talk about around the meal, or here's like a distracting activity that we can pair with the meal, or whatever it is, right? Like just recognizing that can be hard for people.
Yeah, or even like maybe them having some choice about what the food is.
Yeah.
Because certain foods they might feel more compelled to throw up than others.
And this goes like beyond the scope of what we can get into in a webinar, but you're kind of touching on the beauty of potentially having a robust intake process that takes into account, hey, where are folks coming from? What might be challenging for you out on this in the field? How might being in the field be good and supportive for you? But also, are there things we can be aware of from the start about building in some choice or building in some sensitivity about what is and isn't present, while still making sure all the physiological needs and the caloric needs and etc. are met, right? Yeah, so anyway, great awarenesses. Let me go through just a couple more points, because that'll get us through all the content that I wanted to offer you tonight. And just like last time, I'm aware that this is a lot of information that's coming at you. So part of what we're doing here, again, is just planting seeds, and you folks will decide which ones to sprout and which ones to get more into. So we talked a bit about when people don't want our help, right? Waiting or disengaging versus setting boundaries, getting really curious. Getting curious is good for all kinds of things. I will say when people start to be interested in change, and certainly the more interested they get in change, now's a good time for problem solving, right? It's really not that effective to jump into problem solving with someone who's truly pre-contemplative, right? What it tends to do is put a bit of a rift in the relationship, and that can be challenging, right? If you don't start where the person's at, my old supervisor used to say, if you don't start where the person's at, it's hard to take them anywhere. So if someone's truly pre-contemplative, I'd spend a little more time on those conversation quadrants, right? But when someone starts to indicate to you that they're open to problem solving, right? You're like, okay, how can we get from a 3 to a 5 or a 6 to a 10 or 6 to an 8, whatever. Now is a good time to get into problem solving, getting curious about that. In the course, we talk about baby step ladder, which is just what you folks already do naturally, right? You're just breaking things down into steps. How can we just take this one step at a time? When you identify someone's in an action phase, like certainly Denise seems to be in an action phase for some behavior, right? You want to really lean into helping support the person where they're at again, and just acknowledging what it's taken for the person to get there, right? Celebrating those successes, affirming, celebrating courage, or naming courage out loud. If there's incremental change the person's making, that's great. And then one of the things we want to be quite aware of when people are in an action phase, Or for instance, maybe you're bringing someone out on the trip. Maybe Peyton's disclosed to you ahead of the trip that, yeah, I've struggled with disordered eating in the past, and you're setting up a plan for how to support you in the field. And one of the things you want to be aware of if someone is actively making changes is be proactively aware of what might be a trigger for them in the field, right? Now, what we talk about in the course is that we don't necessarily want to avoid triggers. Sometimes avoiding the trigger is the best thing to do. And sometimes avoiding triggers in the long run actually can backfire and make things worse. And so sometimes what you want to do is encourage the person to confront the trigger, but maybe build in some more supports around it. You certainly want to know what the trigger is, right? So we talk about figuring out what the trigger is and building in support plans around it. But when someone's in an action phase, you just want to be proactively aware of the trigger. And then, of course, if someone's in a relapse phase, then you can be reactively reflective about, okay, what was the trigger to go back to this old behavior, right? Maybe for Eric, okay, you haven't done this in a long time. What was challenging about last night, right? And how can we build in more safety around that going forward, perhaps? So trigger identification is really good. With relapses, of course, going back to like the curiosity and the boundaries and having those as hallmarks. But also with relapses, I just like to name that often what can come up for folks is some confusion and shame about whatever brought them back to that old behavior, right? Even if it is a seemingly small thing, right? Oh, I, texted so-and-so that I promised myself I wouldn't text. And so sometimes it can be helpful just to be proactively aware that there might be some big feelings coming up and just give the person an opportunity to save face, right? I like to think of this as like welcoming you back into an appropriate relationship or welcoming you back into being in right relationship with the group or with yourself or whatever that is, right? And last but not least, I'll just end on this note because we always talk in the course about connection is a correction, right? Anywhere the person's at with struggling with a behavior change, whether that's they're conscious of it and they want to change, or they're kind of subconscious or they're in denial and they don't want to change. I always like to go back to this idea of connection as a correction, right? Even if that's setting a boundary, even if that's disengaging and doing nothing, or if the person is on an ongoing journey of behavior change and wants to avoid triggers and whatever, we can always go back to that foundation of connection is the correction. And we know that having good, strong, healthy relationships around us is one of the most productive things that we can do for mental health, and also the most predictive thing that we can offer for long-term mental health. So wherever we can, leaning into connection and relationship. I want to offer you one last chance to go back into breakout rooms and chat about whoever, popped into your mind or whatever kind of last little thoughts you have about this. Again, I know this is a quick one, but let's see if each breakout room can chat about something interesting and come back with one reflection or one piece of feedback for me from tonight. That would be great. If we were to run this webinar again, what would you suggest that I change or make longer or shorter or etc.? Okay. Everyone went right up to the last minute, which I appreciate. Okay, I would love to hear a piece of feedback about the concepts and stuff covered tonight. If folks want to drop something in the chat for me, and or if you'd rather, you can unmute and let your just speak out loud. While you're typing stuff in the chat, I will also do a prize draw for a sticker, and it's occurred to me that I should drop you folks the link to our store just so that you can actually see the stickers that we are chatting about. There you go. Okay, so there's your sticker options. I have them all up on this big fun board as well. We got this, the Feelings Wheel sticker is definitely a favorite. Etc. So if you get chosen for random number draw here while you're typing feedback, Rachel says, appreciated the opportunity to practice and discuss the scenarios. Great. I know it is quite short, so I'm wrestling with that in terms of like how we would do it going forward. But let's see, we got 9 people going here tonight. Corey, I'm just going to count you once. Number 4. Who's number 4? John. There you go, John. Let me know which one you want. I'll pop it in an envelope for you. Other thoughts? We've got, Lisa says, great information in the webinar. Oh, great. I'm glad to hear that, Lisa, and good to have you back. Lita says, great info. Perfect. Was okay. Good. Fair enough. Thanks, Jasper. Yeah, it is a lot to pack into an hour. Great. And Corey says, knew what to expect before going to breakout rooms. That's good. That's my least favorite thing as a participant when we get into breakout rooms and everyone's like, what are we supposed to be doing? Julia said, the scenarios ahead of time would help your brain. Yeah, good feedback. Thanks. I appreciate that. Good. Thanks, folks. Okay, I'm happy to hang out for a couple minutes if anyone wants to chat, but that concludes the formal parts of tonight's quick webinar, so keep your eyes out for the recording. And if you folks come back next week, we're talking about some warm and accessible tools for simple grief and loss conversations, because I think so often if grief comes up unexpectedly, someone just drops, hey, someone is on my mind who has passed. It's so challenging sometimes to even know how to respond to that. And so I like to introduce us to some very simple ways we can hold space for that in a warm way. So that's next week. Thanks, folks. Have a good night.
Thank you
so much.
Bye.
Thanks, Daye.